Michaela struggled with her girth as she crouched down onto the kitchen floor and to her knees. She had made sure to drag the small plastic container of water and solvents with her due to the increased difficulty of getting from place to place. She knew she was doing what she was told not to do, but she had to do something. Besides, she knew the danger to be minimal, and it was her body after all. If she overexerted herself, her body would likely inform her. What she didn't plan on was Brian returning home from work early that day. She'd heard the outer door of the porch open and shut just before hearing the jostling of the living room doorknob. Her husband locked the door each morning before work. Since she was the one who was left in charge of letting the dog out to the yard in the AM, she knew it to be relocked after she had returned inside. The only person other than herself who had a key to that door was her husband. It was too late now. There in the open doorway stood Brian, looking past the living room and into the kitchen, his vision resting upon his wife's guilty face. "I told you that I would do that when I got home. The doctor said bed rest, Haley," Brian said, using the nickname that had been deemed to her for nearly the entirety of her life. There was no purpose in denial. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals that mimicked the scent of wine, and the incriminating plastic bucket sat beside her on the kitchen floor. Michaela was 8 months pregnant and had been deemed a high-risk pregnancy. This resulted in her physician to recommend what was basically nothing more than bed rest until she came to term. She was allowed to do menial tasks and take short walks, as long as she was accompanied, but certain duties, such as scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees with chemical solvents, were a big no-no. The couple had toyed with the idea of buying a mop, but since the square footage of the kitchen was representative of the entire apartment size, being minuscule, it boasted the only non-carpeted floor. The demand for a mop never seemed significant enough to warrant the subsequent purchase. While Haley explained that she couldn't help herself from getting up and doing something, driven nearly to madness with boredom, Brian contemplated buying a mop. Reluctantly, Michaela allowed her husband to escort her back to bed before Brian finished the tiny floor. Since the bed that they were using was currently a pull-out couch in the living room, she had constant access to in-home entertainment. She was able to watch her husband finish up the task that she had started. She enjoyed being pregnant, but in a way, she couldn't wait for it to be over, just so she would be allowed to do things around her apartment again. She listened to what her husband said and stayed in bed, aside from homeostatic demands to use the bathroom for the rest of the night. But when he left for work the next day, she would get back to her old tricks and do a few more odd chores that needed attending to, just to keep herself occupied. By the time she had opened her eyes the following day, the sun was already peeking in through the window, signifying that Brian had already left for work. Michaela stretched in bed, watching about 5 minutes of television, and then decided to make her way towards the bathroom. The bathroom wasn't far. The apartment was extremely small. It was a one-bedroom place, with the bathroom only accessible by crossing through that bedroom. As she entered the bathroom, she glanced down at the dingy box of miscellaneous stuff on the floor. It was compiled of presumably useless refuse left behind by the previous owners, hidden in the black of the back bedroom closet. By the time she was finished in the lavatory, she was determined to look through it. She wasn't expecting to find anything significant, only rummaging through the junk to waste time. Although she shouldn't have, Haley wrestled with the moderately sized box as she carted it back into the living room with her. The majority of it was useless paperwork, consisting of mostly old junk mail. There were a few broken Christmas ornaments, a very heavily worn-out brush, but it was the old photo album that caught her interest. She found herself wondering why the previous tenants would decide to leave it behind. Maybe it was unintentional, she thought to herself. She recalled how the landlord informed them that the people who abandoned the place had done so in a hurry. When they asked him why, he seemed reluctant to tell them, saying they experienced a loss and moved away. Before the couple could reply, they had already begun speaking about better things the small place had to offer. They never really knew anything about the previous occupants of their apartment, but Michaela now held a small window into their lives. As she flipped through the first few pages, she saw a young family, a woman, a man, and a boy, each with yellow hair, performing various activities and posing for particular photo ops in what looked to be like a multitude of locations, most of which seemed to teem with what appeared to be tourists, as most of the photos were of obvious family vacations. After a while, the pages diverted to hold nothing but a single picture of what she believed to be their child. On the last page, that had any photographs on it, was a single picture of the previous couple, a distant look of sadness on their faces, standing in front of their apartment, a moving truck in the parking lot nearby, their son nowhere to be seen. Michaela began to wonder if maybe they had somehow lost their child. Why would they leave this book behind, full of photos? Maybe some queer testament to their child's previous life? What a morbid thought, Haley scolded herself. She stood up to place the book back into the box from which she had retrieved it, and as she stood and went to bend over, her girth caused her balance to shift, and the album dropped to the floor instead of the cardboard box. As she bent down a little further to pick it back up, something in one of the photographs caught her attention. There was something in the background that she had not noticed previously, something that now coaxed an unnatural feeling of anxiety and fear to surface from within her. The picture was that of the trio, wife, husband, and son, standing in front of a large waterfall at what could have been a state park. The forested area was littered with the occasional tourist lingering about the backdrop, but there was someone or something else there as well that hid amongst the trees in the background. It looked so much like them, she at first mistook the shape to be one of those trees. But it was its unmistakable, bald, faceless head that jarred it into form. It appeared to be inhumanly tall. He seemed to be wearing a black business suit, but his legs and arms were absurdly long and assisted in blending it with the trees that surrounded it. The most shocking aspect of this creature is that it didn't seem to have a face, just a blank substrate of pale, white flesh where one should have been. Michaela tried to push the notion aside as just some coincidence of light playing tricks with camera lenses, that is, until she focused on the picture below it. It was a picture of the family at some kind of amusement park or carnival. Among the crowd behind them, the same tall figure loomed over top of them from a distance. Haley slammed the book shut. She could feel an unsettling feeling rising up from within her soul, and she felt it best to just try and put the whole thing aside, box and all. Wiping her brow, she began to saunter towards the close-by kitchen to make herself something to eat. The fridge was just beyond the doorway, viewable from the couch, but a dark shadow in the corner of her eye prompted her attention as she crossed through the threshold. She turned her head, and there was nothing there. She could almost feel the eyes upon her, but there simply wasn't anything there. Haley made haste in preparing some food, which mainly consisted of pie ever since the start of her third trimester, and decided it best to maybe sit as her doctor had ordered her to do, bringing the food with her. Throughout the day, the daytime television, the napping, and trips back and forth to the bathroom, she couldn't get rid of that sensation. She saw nothing, experienced nothing paranormal, but consistently felt as though she was being watched. Michaela thought of calling a few people here and there throughout the day just to help ease her mind, but everyone she knew happened to be at work. Her anxiety kept building right up until the moment Brian came home from work. In fact, she'd become so worked up, she even questioned whether or not it was her husband, that maybe it was an intruder, ignoring the fact that there was only one other key. Relief washed over her as Brian walked in from the enclosed porch and into the living room. He asked her about her day, and she told him nothing about what she found, even going to certain measures to hide that she touched the box at all. But he could sense her unease. Brian made a small dinner for the two of them and popped in an old comedy on VHS to help lighten the mood. The VCR hadn't been used in years, and the tape was even older than the machine, so, although having to adjust the tracking a bit, it was perfectly watchable. It made for a poor quality viewing by modern standards. Michaela's dread subsided. Her husband's presence served as a constant reassurance. Brian stood up from his side of the couch bed, walking around in front of the TV to get a drink, and as he passed by the TV, he asked Haley if she wanted anything. The tracking on the video began to obscure the bottom of the screen a bit, but she really didn't notice it at first, as she was looking at Brian, replying that she wanted some cookies from the cupboard. It was when he disappeared into the kitchen, out of sight, that she finally noticed the diminishing quality of the video, now jumping and flashing with static. In one of the flashes, she could have sworn that she'd seen something barely distinguishable within the screen fuzz. It may have been passed over if it had not gathered more discernible features in the next subsequent flash. Michaela's fear returned tenfold as within each flash, lingering for only a fraction of a second, the figure seemed to get closer and closer to the screen from within the television. Once the black suit and tie, worn by a hideously malformed, faceless man, became too discernible to deny, Michaela let out a powerful shout. Brian came rushing to her side. Haley sobbed for a moment and said nothing for a few more, and then lied to her husband by telling him that she had seen a hideous spider, fearing that he would think her crazy. She allowed him to search for the proclaimed arachnid for a while before telling him that it had likely disappeared when she shrieked. Haley reasoned to herself that she must have imagined it. It took a while to convince herself of something that her eyes couldn't dispute, but given her condition, mild hysterical episodes could possibly be related to stress. As much of a stretch as it was, it seemed more rational than the latter. After another movie, and once again attaining a sense of security, Haley would eventually drift off to sleep with her husband. It was the odd noise that awakened her to consciousness. She didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. Nothing after what had woke her up in the first place. Since the initial sound is what had roused her, it was muffled and indecipherable to her waking ears. In fact, Haley surmised that she had woken up on her own. She attempted to sleep once again, but a nagging thirst beckoned at the back of her throat. Having her unease being shaken off a long time ago, she was uninhibited from proceeding to the kitchen to quench her thirst. When she turned on the light, she saw a dark mass in the corner of her eye yet again, just in sight of her peripheral vision. Only this time, when she looked, there was something there. It was tall, menacing, and faceless. Haley went out to cry for help, but as the thing outstretched its inhumanly long arms, she felt a desire to do so. Leave her. Haley took one step forward before her world went instantly black. A loud, blood-curdling shout forced Brian to a panic-stricken sitting position, jolting him from sleep. He immediately noticed that the kitchen light was on, and his wife screaming loudly from somewhere within it. Brian jumped to his feet and clambered to the kitchen archway. his flesh drained of color as his eyes widened, pupils dilating and jaw going slack, before covering it with 2 shaking hands. Haley was sitting upon the linoleum floor, covered in the same crimson that surrounded her in a pool. She was covered from the waist down in blood. Brian's fears were reasonable in their convictions, but the doctor's diagnosis would only leave them with more questions. But Haley already knew. She knew before the ambulance that brought her to the hospital was even called. She knew it as soon as she had regained consciousness. That thing had stolen her baby.